Hello, Dr. Bennett here. Um, this morning I want to talk to you about the Enlightenment, which was a major movement of ideas in Western civilization. And actually, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the sort of new trust in rationality, was happening all over the world. It wasn't just in Europe. We tend to think a lot about Europe as our predecessor as Americans. You know, we fought the Revolutionary War to sort of break away from our parents in Great Britain. And we also had the Spanish in the Southwest. And so we often think of ourselves as sort of these independent, teenagers that have broken out and we're on our own now. But we can't forget that we also had people here when the colonists came. And so we also have Native American influences that we'll be looking at this semester. But the Enlightenment is an important movement, partly because the people that came to America, to the continent, and began to settle were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment in Europe. So that's one reason I'm going to focus on Europe just for this conversation. So I have a timeline in the content area of D2L, and it's in the general materials file. I have printed out a copy because I want to do a quick sort of review of this timeline. We'll be looking at it all semester as a touchstone, but just to get us started, we're going to start with the Civil War era in the U.S., and we're going to move to the present. We're going to look at literature that comes down through time. So we're starting American Lit 1, it goes up to the Civil War, and American Lit 2 goes on from there. So the Enlightenment started way earlier than our semester assignments, our readings, but we need to understand the Enlightenment to understand a lot about American identity. So I wanted to spend just a minute or two talking about the Enlightenment before we move on to start our readings with Walt Whitman and the Transcendentalists. Okay, so we're still influenced by the Enlightenment even after we sort of move on to some other notions. In fact, today we are still heavily dependent on the ideas of the Enlightenment. So, what was the Enlightenment? Well, in Europe, before the Enlightenment, some people call the period after the classical period the Dark Ages. It was sort of, we think of it as a period of kind of ignorance and violence, and we were not very sophisticated during that period, at least our European ancestors, those of us who have European ancestors. And that medieval period went up into about the 5th century. I'm sorry, it went up to about the 14th century. Okay, so we're talking all the way up to about the 1300s. And during that period, a lot of people couldn't read. Books were handwritten, hardly anybody read at all. And it was very expensive, to get a hold of a book. The Roman Catholic Church was basically in charge, even legally, and superstition prevailed. Most people thought the world could be explained mainly through religion. And the church influenced law, art, and social relationships. So the church was really the center of our understanding of the universe. During the Renaissance, we began to sort of return to the classical forms of Greek and Roman civilization. So we felt like we were becoming a little more sophisticated, and we had people like Shakespeare writing during that period. That went up through the 1600s. In the 1700s, though, with the late 1600s and early 1700s, we had this sort of blossoming of science and ideas that began to focus less on superstition and more on reason. And the idea was that we could become more moral and more stable as a culture, as a society, if we would depend more on our brain than our fears and our superstitions. So there was a move away from religion to some extent, and a kind of new fascination with science. So we had people like Copernicus and Galileo making discoveries during that period. And we had sort of small scientific advancements, um, we were starting to figure out that if you washed your hands, you wouldn't get sick and things like that. So by the time we get to the late 1700s in the United States and the early 1800s, right up to about the middle of the 1800s, where we're going to begin, um, we sort of had a group that was pushing against the Enlightenment that said, we're not just brains. We do have a brain, but we also have feelings, we have imagination and all that. So I'm going to go back just a minute and talk a little more about the Enlightenment, because when we get started next class period, we're going to be talking about how the U.S. founding documents were based on a lot of those Enlightenment ideas. So some of the key ideas were that each person had a mind, and that person had all this potential to learn. Before it was kind of like if you were born as a peasant, well, it meant God wanted you to be a peasant, and you should just stay there and be a really good peasant. If you were a king, well, God put you in place. That was called divine right. So you were sort of born noble if you were noble in wealth as well as character and strength and all that stuff. So with the Enlightenment came the idea that each individual was noble in him or herself, that each individual had all this potential and could learn, and also had inherent rights. So this was the birth of the idea that each of us had rights to kind of fulfill who we were. And this led to a philosophy called humanism, which was sort of focused on the individual and the idea that if we could develop each individual to their potential, society and the world would be a better place and we can make all kinds of progress. So you can see from thinking about those ideas how the United States culture is really based on that idea. Today, it is still a really strong part of how we think about who we are in the world. I'm not going to say any more. I have asked you to watch another video that is a more kind of historic look at the Enlightenment, but I wanted you to have at least a little bit of introduction before you get to that, because it's he's throwing around a lot of concepts, and I wanted to make sure that you were clear on what he was talking about. So we'll talk some more about this next class period. Thanks.